What's good, everybody? Welcome to the Big Nate Review. It's your boy, Big Nate. Today we have a dope-ass discussion that we're going to be talking about. Today we are talking about book banning. And this was prompted by a recent event that took place, I think sometime last week, around the Albuquerque Public School District Board meeting where apparently protests erupted over what ended up being this idea of banning books, specifically LGBTQ books. So that was an event that took place, but I want to make this like a larger discussion about just banning books in general. Why, if at all, should books be banned? Who are the people making those judgment calls? And if so, what types of books are the ones that should be banned? So we're going to have a larger discussion about book banning in general. But anyway, if you're new here, welcome to the Big Nate Review. And like I said, we got a dope ass discussion to talk about. So I want to first lead in with just the actual event that I was talking about. So again, there was the Albuquerque Public School District. I don't know exactly the details, but apparently I don't know what else to call him besides like an influencer pastor who actually just completely impromptu showed up to this national or whatever, the public school board meeting. And even though book banning was not a topic at all, the announcement of his presence ended up bringing a huge following on both sides. So people that were on his side, which spoiler alert is to ban the LGBTQ books, and then there were a bunch of people protesting that idea. Obviously that books should not be banned, and particularly these books in general. So basically the influencer pastor just came, crashed the public school district party, and so we're gonna actually just look at a clip here showing describing the events that unfolded.
Heated protests erupted outside an Albuquerque school board meeting earlier this evening. News 13's Bella Olage is live in the Newsplex tonight to explain why.
Social media posts from a local church and from LGBTQ plus advocacy groups spurred more than 100 members of the community to show up in protest and to support a speaker that one board member called problematic.
This district has become the P. Diddy of the American education system. It's disgusting what you are allowing to happen to children. You have boys going to school wearing thongs and wearing crop tops. This is unnecessary and unacceptable. If you support perverted books being in schools, you're either a pervert or an ally of perversion.
Okay, so yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, but first thing that needs unpacking is just what a banger line. This school has become the P. Diddy of the American education system. That's just love him or hate him, that's a banger. And also just the rhetoric. Do you hear this? He said, "You're either a pervert or you are an ally of perversion." You got to give it to him. He got the rhetoric on deck. So I tried my best to actually find out what some of these books were, like these LGBTQ books that in other videos people are calling like pornographic. I have no idea what the relationship between, or how he's aware of this information about men coming to school in thongs and crop tops and stuff like that. And I don't know what the relation is with the presence of LGBTQ books necessarily. But with all that out the way, I did this event, this video kind of just got me thinking in general just about book banning, just as a concept, like whether or not books really should be banned, and again, if so, at what point. And so I just started watching some videos on it, and I thought there was a pretty cool video posted by Vice News, which actually got into some of the statistics about book banning, at least here in the US, and I thought that was super interesting. So I'm just going to go ahead and play some clips of that here as well.
Since last summer, parents, school boards, and thirsty political groups have pulled off over 1,500 book bans in schools across the US. That's more bans than in 2018, 2019, and 2020 combined. Actual book bans have taken hold in districts in over half the states and hit more than 1,000 different titles. Some books have been removed in many districts. Others got targeted in only one. The titles range from books that only a few advanced readers might be interested in, to picture books about making tamales at Christmas. Many of the banned books have main characters who are people of color. About a quarter directly address race or racism. A little more than that deal with themes related to being LGBTQ.
Okay, yeah, so I thought that was actually really interesting. I didn't realize, honestly, until after that video, how much of this book banning was actually going on. I knew book banning was a thing, but I honestly didn't think it was a super prevalent phenomenon. But the way that he's talking about it with over 1,500 book bans and book bans in over half the states, and especially I don't exactly know what is considered a book ban, but when you consider the idea of what is and is not included in the curriculum, or just in general what's even available at a school library, that stuff actually has, I think, pretty important implications, especially when you consider the fact that I was dumbfounded when the one that struck me most here, honestly, was the book banning of the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. I cannot think of one reason why you would ban the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. You might as well just ban fucking Martin Luther King Jr. while you're at it. I don't know. That's a book, for instance, that I do recall It's been a while, but I do recall actually learning that in school. And that's one of those books that I think is just so important because it gives you the perspective on things like slavery. You know, like I've mentioned this like a bunch of times at this point, but it's one thing to learn about slavery. It's another thing to read the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. And that's the type of stuff that really are sort of like core memories in the sense that it's like it introduces you to this really whole new perspectives. You know, and I actually literally just mentioned in the last video, so I don't want to harp on it, but even, you know, with the stuff like with the Holocaust stories, those things just give a whole different life and color to what it was like to actually experience that just like the factual textbook knowledge doesn't. So to ban something like the life of Frederick Douglass, on the one hand, there's that level of absurdity, and then on the other hand, there's the level of absurdity of you're banning a kid's book on tamales. That one truly just defies belief. Like, I don't know what's going on in between the covers of those pages, but I can't imagine it was that bad that a kid's book on making tamales needed to get banned. Maybe people just don't like flavor. Maybe people don't like good foods, in which case that would make perfect sense. Shout out to tamales. But also you can see from that video, there was like this emphasis just in general on, you know, people of color, LGBTQ books that talk about race. So there tend to be the theme here of like basically like these, you know, culture war, you know, the idea of like wokeness infecting the schools, that kind of stuff. Because one of the books that they mentioned was what looked like a pretty popular book, you know, Gender Queer. And, you know, the thing is that we'll talk about, it is one thing. I think there are potentially interesting cases where books really might actually ought to be banned. But in cases where it's just, you know, genuine novels, like, you know, books with actual literary merit, just everyday run-of-the-mill books and novels that just happen to be dealing with this specific subject content, that to me just seems sort of inexcusable to exclude from schools. Now, there are cases, I think, where it might actually be justifiable to ban a book from school. So one of the books that comes to mind is Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler, and that's, as I understand, I haven't read it, but as I understand it, it's essentially the autobiography of Adolf Hitler. And, you know, obviously it doesn't take a whole stretch of the imagination to imagine why you might not want to introduce to young, impressionable students the thought process and ideology of somebody who was responsible for one of the greatest tragedies of human history. But on the other hand, that might be actually a reason to not ban Mein Kampf, because Hitler and the Holocaust was one of the most important historical figures and one of the most important historical events that has ever taken place. So you could obviously see a reason why that actually just, you know, whether or not you agree with the content, should just be included, just if anything, purely as like a historical text. And if anything, you could use that as an example. You know, you can find arguments to take it down or find out, you know, use that to actually critique Hitler and his philosophy. So that would be an argument for keeping it in. On the other end of the spectrum, you have a book like The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. This is one of the greatest pieces of American literature. Mark Twain is one of the great, like, most famous American authors to ever do it, right? These are books, or, you know, Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, but I'm thinking Huck Finn particularly, with immense literary merit, right? But obviously, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is, because it takes place in the South at a time where slavery and racism is rampant, there is obviously the N-word dropped with the hard R very frequently, right? And there's racial stereotypes and all these different things. So it's understandable why you might not want to actively teach that in curriculum. And I have a friend who's black, and he recounted to me one time a story where he was in, like, I don't know how old he was, but he was in a classroom, and I think it was mostly white students, for what that's worth, and the teacher was reading the book aloud, but she did not pull any punches and was just dropping the N-word with the hard R, just, you know, as it came about in the story. Which he said, and I think it doesn't take a huge stretch of the imagination to hear your teacher dropping the hard R while you're one of the only black students in a classroom. It's no stretch of the imagination to make you think that might be, you know, genuinely uncomfortable. And so there's also this question, I think, too, of like what books should actively be taught in the curriculum, right? This is mandatory assigned reading for everybody, or reading it aloud in the classroom, versus also just, you know, what's available in, you know, the student library. I think those two are two different questions. Like, we probably shouldn't be actively teaching Mein Kampf in social studies, but it might be another question to see whether it's available just, you know, in the public library. So, and again, I think these questions actually are important because, you know, at least I know when I was a student, I frequented the library, and the books that I read in class, right, for assigned reading, those are, and especially in this day and age where people basically don't read outside of what they're taught in school, what we decide to teach at school is going to become increasingly important. So for instance, I went on the Wikipedia page to look at what some of these banned books actually are, and I was really surprised by the results. As well, not only the results, but the reasons for why they were being banned. So here, I'm gonna pull my laptop and just name a couple examples. Okay, so we have Anne Frank, Diary of a Young Girl. and it's banned for discussions of puberty and teenage sexuality. It's like, okay, so we're banning the Diary of Anne Frank. That's crazy. Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. Content dealing with menstrual cycles and feminine hygiene. Like, the idea that you would ban a book because it's teaching feminine hygiene is just batshit crazy. Beloved, I've talked about this book. Themes regarding slavery and violence. And again, that's one of those books like the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, which is just huge for giving you a perspective on these historical events. As I Lay Dying by William Faulkner, dealing with issues of death, abortion. Black Boy, themes of communism, sexual content, racism, and atheism. Brave New World, anti-religious and anti-family themes, sexual content, and I think this is the icing on the cake. Cat's Cradle, language, animal abuse, anti-religious themes, and, drumroll please, scatological humor. So the idea that you would ban books because they deal with things like death or slavery or scatological humor or menstrual cycles or sexuality, you're essentially just whitewashing the entire human experience. Like, you're not going to find any books that don't deal with, at some level, uncomfortable topics. And I mean, that is, I think, arguably one of the benefits of literature, is that it forces you to think about uncomfortable things. Like, if you're not making yourself uncomfortable, particularly when learning about things like history and slavery and, like, you know, this, even the history of LGBTQ rights and everything, you kind of should be feeling a little bit uncomfortable. And the idea that you would not include all that just means you're sterilizing your worldview in a way that's completely not productive for, like, you know, growth and intellectual development and all that good stuff that should be being taught in schools. So this is just a topic I thought was interesting, and the more I kind of dove into it, it was more important and more pervasive of an issue than I actually thought. But I want to hear what you guys think. Like, who are the people making the judgment calls? Is there some kind of rule or threshold at which, like, a book should be either included just in general, like in the public, like, you know, in the library, versus also being actively taught? Where do you guys think the question of literary merit comes into here, right? Because if there's just like a tweaker on the side of the road who's like schizoed out and they're just writing this manifesto of just like hate speech, like there's that book obviously should not be allowed in schools or anything like that, because it has no literary merit, or it's not situated in a particular cultural context. But again, where is that line actually drawn? What do you guys think about book banning in general? Like I said, in general, I tend to think that books should be included. I'm very like anti-banning, but there are some interesting cases where it might actually make sense. And this is also not to include the fact that there's the existence of the internet and like public life. Like, you know, it's one thing to ban things in school, but you're really not completely cutting them off from accessing these texts because of, you know, the world in which we live. But the question of what schools do put forth actively as a curriculum and what's available is actually, I think, a very interesting and important question. But anyway, thank you all for watching the Big Nate review. It's your boy, Big Nate. Follow me on Big Nate's book reviews on Instagram. Let me know if there's any topics you want me to talk about, anything like that. And yeah, thank you for watching the Big Nate review.